The paper titled, Ring-Linear Mixtures of Semiflexible Rubber Bands, investigates the structure of blends of ring and linear filaments in the context of polymer materials. The introduction begins by highlighting the common occurrence of mixtures containing both ring and linear molecules during the synthesis of ring polymers. It is noted that recent studies have shown that even small quantities of linear molecules can have a significant impact on the shape and rheological response of ring polymers. To further explore this phenomenon, the authors conducted an investigation using disordered assemblies of open and closed rubber bands as a model system. The structure of these mixtures was analyzed using X-ray tomography, with a focus on how the length and composition of the linear bands influenced the overall mixture. The introduction highlights the key difference between fully flexible polymers and semiflexible ring-linear mixtures. While increasing the concentration of linear bands in fully flexible polymers would lead to an expansion of the rings, the authors found that in semiflexible ring-linear mixtures, increasing the concentration of linear bands could actually decrease the average size of the rings. This reduction in size was attributed to a decrease in inter-ring threading, which naturally occurs as the proportion of rings diminishes. The authors conducted molecular dynamic simulations to validate these findings and confirmed that the results are indeed due to the semiflexibility of the bands rather than confinement or athermal conditions. The introduction also provides a brief overview of the challenges in studying ring polymers compared to linear polymers. Rings do not have ends, which means they cannot reptate like linear chains to renew and relax configurations after external stress. The behavior of rings in terms of structure and dynamics remains elusive, and there is ongoing debate about whether tube theories can be applied to understand their relaxation dynamics. The introduction mentions early work by Cates and Deutsch that predicted an expansion of rings in the presence of linear contaminants, but notes that their predictions were based on simulations of fully flexible polymers. The authors aim to investigate whether these predictions hold true for semiflexible ring-linear mixtures. Overall, the introduction provides a comprehensive overview of the motivation for the study, the specific research questions being addressed, and the key findings from previous studies. It sets the stage for the subsequent sections of the paper, which delve into the experimental methods, results, and discussions, as well as the simulations and their comparison to the experimental findings. Structure of ring-linear mixture of rubber bands. Insights from X-ray tomography. This figure showcases the structure of a ring-linear mixture of rubber bands obtained from X-ray tomography. The study aims to investigate the impact of linear contaminants on the structure of rings in such mixtures. Previous studies using molecular dynamic simulations have shown that linear contaminants can lead to an effective expansion of rings and increase the viscosity of the system. In this study, X-ray tomography is used to provide experimental evidence for these phenomena. The figure displays a typical X-ray tomography image of a ring-linear mixture of rubber bands, with the concentration of linear contaminants increasing from left to right. The rings are represented by the color red, while the linear bands are represented by the color light blue. The different compositions of the mixtures are indicated by the values of phi, which represent the fraction of linear bands in the mixture. The X-ray tomography images provide detailed insights into the spatial arrangement and configurations of the bands in the mixture. By analyzing these images, the researchers can determine the modifications in the mixture structure as the length and concentration of linear bands vary. This figure serves as an overview of the experimental setup and provides a visual representation of the ring-linear mixture of rubber bands that will be further analyzed in subsequent sections. Figure 2 of the paper shows the impact of linear contaminants on the structure of ring-linear mixtures of rubber bands using X-ray tomography. The figure presents tomographic reconstructions of ring-linear mixtures with increasing concentrations of linear bands. The rings are depicted in red, while the linear bands are shown in light blue. As the proportion of linear bands increases from left to right, the figure visually demonstrates the changes in the structure of the mixture. The significance of Figure 2 to the paper is that it provides experimental evidence for the reduction in the average size of rings within a semiflexible ring-linear mixture as the concentration of linear bands increases. This finding is contrary to the behavior observed in fully flexible polymers, where the addition of linear contaminants leads to the expansion of rings. The reduction in ring size in semiflexible systems is attributed to a decrease in inter-ring threading as the proportion of rings diminishes. The figure supports the main conclusion of the paper that the behavior of ring linear mixtures is dependent on the semiflexibility of the bands or chains rather than confinement or athermal conditions. Other figures that are useful to discuss in relation to Figure 2 are Figure 3, which shows the persistence length of the rubber bands and demonstrates that both ring and linear bands fall within the semiflexible regime, and Figure 9, which presents the threading analysis of simulated blends and illustrates the increase in threading by linear chains and the decrease in total threading on semiflexible rings as the fraction of linear chains increases. These figures provide additional support for the observed reduction in ring size in semiflexible ring linear mixtures. Figure 3 in the scientific paper shows the persistence length of both ring and linear bands in the mixtures of semiflexible rubber bands. The figure illustrates the ratio of the contour length of the bands to their persistence length, which is a measure of their rigidity. It is shown that both ring and linear bands fall within the semiflexible regime, with the rings exhibiting slightly higher rigidity due to their confinement. The lengthier bands of type B display greater flexibility than type A bands. The significance of this figure to the paper is that it confirms the semiflexibility of the bands in the mixtures and provides a basis for understanding the structural changes observed in the mixtures. It suggests that the behavior of the mixtures is influenced by the semiflexibility of the bands rather than confinement or athermal conditions. The results from the experiments using rubber bands are consistent with the results from molecular dynamics (MD) simulations of semiflexible ring linear polymer blends in bulk. The simulations show that when linear chains are added to blends of flexible chains, the rings expand, whereas in blends of semiflexible chains, the rings contract. This demonstrates the importance of considering the specific characteristics of the polymer chains, such as their flexibility, in understanding the behavior of ring linear mixtures. Overall, Figure 3 provides important information about the rigidity of the bands in the mixtures and supports the conclusions drawn from the experimental and simulation results regarding the influence of semiflexibility on the structural changes observed in the ring linear mixtures. It helps to establish the relationship between the rigidity of the bands and the behavior of the mixtures, leading to a better understanding of the underlying mechanisms governing the properties of these polymer blends. Figure 4 in the paper shows the threading analysis of ring linear mixtures of rubber bands. The figure presents the number of ring-ring threadings, black squares, and ring linear threadings, red dots, as a function of the fraction of linear bands in the mixture. The figure also includes the total threading of rings, blue triangles, which is the sum of ring-ring and ring linear threadings. The significance of Figure 4 is that it provides insight into the structural changes that occur in ring linear mixtures of rubber bands. It shows that as the concentration of linear bands increases, the number of ring-ring threadings decreases, while the number of ring linear threadings increases. This indicates that the linear bands are more likely to thread through the rings than other rings. This threading behavior leads to a reduction in the average size of the rings within the mixture. These findings are consistent with the experimental observations using X-ray tomography and molecular dynamic simulations. It confirms that the reduction in ring size in the presence of linear bands is a result of the semi-flexibility of the bands, rather than confinement or athermal conditions. The conclusions drawn from Figure 4 support the overall objective of the paper, which is to investigate the influence of linear contaminants on the structure of ring linear polymer blends. It provides important insights into the behavior of semiflexible ring linear mixtures and contributes to our understanding of the interactions between ring and linear polymers in such systems. Figure 5. This figure shows the normalized frequencies of the local curvature of rings and linear bands in ring linear mixtures of rubber bands. The x-axis represents the curvature values, while the y-axis represents the normalized frequencies. The blue curve represents the curvature distribution of rings, and the red curve represents the curvature distribution of linear bands. The figure demonstrates that the curvature distribution of linear bands does not change significantly with the fraction of linear bands in the mixture. However, the curvature distribution of rings remains relatively constant for low fractions of linear bands, but shifts towards higher curvatures for high fractions of linear bands. Significance. Figure 5 provides insights into the structural differences between rings and linear bands in ring linear mixtures of rubber bands. It shows that the curvature distribution of linear bands is relatively unchanged by the presence of rings, indicating that linear bands do not significantly influence their own conformation within the mixture. On the other hand, the curvature distribution of rings does show some variation with the fraction of linear bands, suggesting that the presence of linear bands affects the conformation of the rings. This finding is significant because it indicates that the addition of linear bands can lead to a contraction in the size of the rings, contrary to previous observations in fully flexible polymer systems. Figure 6 in this scientific paper shows the variation of the normalized gyration ratio of rings in MD simulations of ring linear polymer blends. The gyration ratio represents the size of the rings, with a value of 1 indicating the size of rings in pure melts without any linear contaminant. The figure compares the gyration ratio of rings in blends with flexible chains, red circles, and semi-flexible chains, blue circles. The results demonstrate contrasting behavior between the two types of blends. In the case of flexible chains, the gyration ratio increases as the fraction of linear chains in the blend increases, indicating an expansion of the rings. However, in the case of semi-flexible chains, the gyration ratio decreases with increasing linear chain fraction, suggesting a contraction of the rings. This observation is consistent with the experimental findings using rubber bands, where a similar reduction in ring size was observed in the presence of linear chains. These results confirm that the observed behavior is not an artifact of the experimental system and highlight the unique interplay between the chains in different types of polymer blends. The figure provides important insights into the structural properties of ring linear mixtures and the influence of linear contaminants on the size of the rings. Figure 7 in the paper shows the threading analysis of ring linear mixtures of rubber bands. The figure consists of 4 panels. Panel A illustrates the threading of a ring by another ring and by a linear band. Panel B shows the number of ring-ring threadings, while Panel C shows the number of ring linear threadings, both as a function of the fraction of linear bands. Finally, Panel D displays the average total length of threaded segments in both systems. The significance of Figure 7 is that it provides insights into the threading behavior of rings in the presence of linear bands. The results show that as the concentration of linear bands increases, there is an increase in the threading of rings by linear bands and a decrease in the threading of rings by other rings. This reduction in inter-ring threading leads to a decrease in the average size of rings within the semiflexible ring linear mixture. These findings are in contrast to the behavior observed in fully flexible polymer blends and highlight the importance of considering the semiflexibility of the bands in understanding the structural properties of ring linear mixtures. Additionally, the figure confirms the experimental observations using rubber bands by conducting molecular dynamic simulations. The simulation results support the experimental findings and demonstrate that the ring shrinkage in the presence of linear bands is not an artifact of experimental constraints or insufficient relaxation. Overall, Figure 7 provides valuable information about the threading dynamics in ring linear mixtures of semiflexible rubber bands and contributes to the understanding of the structural properties of these mixtures. Figure 8 in the scientific paper shows the gyration ratio of rings in MD simulations of ring linear polymer blends. The gyration ratio measures the size of the rings, with a value less than 1 indicating a decrease in size. The figure compares the gyration ratio of rings in blends with flexible chains, red circles, and semi-flexible chains, blue circles. The results show contrasting behavior between the two types of blends. In the case of flexible chains, the rings expand when linear chains are added, as expected. However, in the case of semi-flexible chains, the rings contract as the fraction of linear chains increases. This finding is consistent with the experimental observations using rubber bands, where a similar reduction in ring dimensions was observed in the presence of linear chains. The significance of Figure 8 is that it confirms the experimental findings by showing that the observed ring shrinkage in the presence of linear chains is not an artifact of a constrained or insufficiently relaxed experimental system. The simulations provide further evidence that the contraction in ring size in semi-flexible blends is a result of the reduction in inter-ring threading as the fraction of linear chains increases. This highlights the importance of understanding the distinct responses of ring structures in different types of polymer blends, which can have implications for the design and manipulation of materials with customized properties. Figure 9 of the paper shows the threading analysis of simulated blends of ring and linear polymer chains. The figure displays the threading of rings by other rings, by linear chains, and the total threading of rings as the fraction of linear chains increases in both flexible and semi-flexible blends. The results show that the number of threadings by linear chains increases with the fraction of linear chains in both systems. However, the total threadings on semi-flexible rings decrease, explaining why their size shrinks with more linear chains in semi-flexible blends. This finding is significant as it confirms the experimental observations obtained using rubber bands, indicating that the observed ring contraction in the presence of linear chains is not an artifact of experimental constraints or insufficient relaxations. The simulations support the notion that the reduction in ring size in semi-flexible blends is attributed to a decrease in inter-ring threading as the fraction of linear chains increases. This highlights the unique behavior of semi-flexible blends compared to fully flexible blends, where ring expansion occurs in the presence of linear chains. These results provide valuable insights into the behavior of ring-linear mixtures and contribute to our understanding of the interactions between ring and linear chains. Understanding these interactions is important for designing and manipulating materials with tailored rheological and mechanical properties. The paper investigates the structure of mixtures of ring and linear polymer chains, specifically focusing on semiflexible rubber bands. The authors use X-ray tomography to analyze the structure of these mixtures and observe the impact of the length and composition of linear bands on the overall mixture. Contrary to previous findings in fully flexible polymers, the authors find that increasing the concentration of linear bands in a semiflexible ring-linear mixture actually decreases the average size of the rings. This reduction in ring size is attributed to a decrease in inter-ring threading as the proportion of rings decreases. Molecular dynamics simulations confirm these findings and demonstrate that the behavior is due to the semiflexibility of the bands rather than confinement or athermal conditions. The authors conclude that understanding the behavior of ring-linear mixtures is crucial for designing materials with customized properties. If you are an author or copyright holder for the work presented in this video and you have any issue with the existence or contents of this video, please let me know.